Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing an episode today that could be controversial as it relates to the religions of the world, specifically the Quran. And as we talk about the New Testament against what's the reliability of it to the Quran's reliability, the history behind both, we spent a lot of time on this channel over the years defending New Testament authorship, canonicity, getting in even to the textual variations. We've talked about some of those on here, some that are important, some that are less important. But this is probably one of the great debates when we're looking outside of the scope of Christianity and we're looking inwardly to our text and saying, do we have a reliable text? Do we have the words of the original autographs that have been preserved through the body of manuscripts where we can reconstruct what was the original New Testament? We believe we have that. We don't believe it's in a singular manuscript, nor do we believe that it can be done in a perfect sense where we look at it and say, hey, we have absolute certainty at every single location where there is a passage of scripture. We think there's some variation that has weight and evidence that could be one reading over the other. But the question in those situations, whether or not you have one reading or the other, you're not left with, I don't know if we have the reading of what the original writers wrote. We have a debate about which one it likely was. That's different than there's entirety missing. There's added things that we have no clue to. This is the evidence that we have been fighting for and discussing against atheists, against liberalism. This is something that has come up that was created and blown way out of proportion with New York Times #1 bestseller, misquoting Jesus from Bart Ehrman. He's been refuted over and over and over again from other scholars that have come into this now, like Elijah Hickson, Peter Gurry, John Mead. These guys have come in and answered this. Myths and Mistakes of New Testament Textual Criticism is a big, important book that has come out in the recent years. Multiple scholars coming together to write individual chapters on their field of study to refute ideas both in the Christian and outside of the Christian world, criticizing the way the text is, how we should look at it. And they refuted quite a bit of the mythology that has made itself in the scholarship, saying, we don't have the New Testament. We don't know what the New Testament looks like. We have copies of copies of copies of copies of the New Testament. Therefore, we cannot say these are the words of Jesus, these are the words of Paul, etc. That has been debunked. That has been refuted. We've bought into that sometimes in this program. We've looked at some of the evidence on specific passages of scripture, and we'll continue to do that as time goes on. We've had other scholars come on and even discuss that with us as well. But as it relates to the Quran itself has major flashing issues that go beyond the New Testament. And I'm going to actually kind of put them side by side to demonstrate that the New Testament is superior to the Quran, not just in its claim, but in its textual integrity. And that's what I want to focus on in the program today. Now, let's talk about some of the issues with the Quran, like just from its very conception, from its very beginnings, as we talk about where did it come from? How do we know what words are which? How do we know which teachings belong to who? It's widely acknowledged that there has never been an actual critical edition that produced a Quran-based text from extant manuscripts. Now, we have that in the New Testament. We have multiple critical editions. We're actually on, whether you're talking about the Nestle and Allen text, whether you're talking about all the different editions there, the 29th edition being the big one being talked about. Now we've also looked into different ways with even computers examining the text and giving us ideas of what would have been a better reading and carrying weight, making a few adjustments there. When you're talking about the editions of the Nestle and Allen, 27, 28, or looking into a 29, when you're talking about this, we have multiple updated editions of critical texts. My goodness, this has been going on for a long time. This is not just something that just recently took place in scholarship. This was happening during the days of Desiderius Erasmus, when he produced an edition of the New Testament with a form of a diglot, with the Latin on one side and the Greek on the other side, when he was producing that all the way back in the early 1500s. Even cardinals came together, Cardinal Jimenez, looking into all these things, going in and putting together the polyglot. These kinds of additions were coming, and even multifaceted, like the polyglot had multiple languages in it. There was always a desire in the New Testament to examine manuscripts, looking at the difference and make critical assertions and choices and give reason to it. That's why even when you look at the Stephanus edition, Theodore Beza in the late 16th century had multiple notes and annotations at the bottom of his text, discovering and telling you why he went with readings the way that he did and why he disagreed with readings the way that he did. This was not unusual. This was happening all the way back in the 16th century with a lesser amount of manuscripts for sure. Of course, we don't know what the polyglot was using, but we know that there was something being used with multiple manuscripts, whether it's even 10 or 12 or 100, to come together and say, what would have been the more likely reading for the original? And now we have a plethora of manuscripts. We're looking at it from the whole thing, from textual families, we're talking about family 1, family 13, or whether you're looking into the papyrus themselves, just looking at fragmented sense, whether it's P52, whether it's P66, P75, whatever manuscript you're looking at, it's taking all that into account. It's considering things like its date, considering its things like its usage, its commonality with other manuscripts in different regions. There's even major families within the Byzantine that are broken down. And many Byzantine scholars have done tremendous work on this, whether you're looking at Mu 5, Mu 6, Mu 7. That's how Dr. Maurice Robinson, who's currently retired from the work, but did extensive work even on the Pericope Adultera, looking at the woman caught in adultery story, looking at it from the Byzantine differences. These things become exceedingly important for us to note that the New Testament scholars of the day and in the past have always sought to produce what would become some sort of critical edition. We can take this back to Jerome. We can take this all the way back to Origen in the 2nd century, who is creating these hexaplets, particularly of the Old Testament, like books like Job and Psalms, trying to get critical editions of the Old and New Testament to demonstrate to us what the original readings likely were. To this day, it is widely acknowledged that the Quran does not have a critical edition. It does not have a text based on extant manuscripts. In the New Testament and even in the Old Testament now, especially with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the different readings from the Peshitta, the Sirach, and even going into the Ethiopic texts and other languages, we have the ability to produce critical editions of the Old and New Testament that the Quran cannot produce. They do not have one. The current printed edition. So what are the current printed editions that the Quran actually has? Listen, they're medieval Islamic traditions. They're based on not at that time of its origination or even nearness to that, but rather medieval tradition. Instead of collating manuscripts and looking at all the analysis of the differing manuscripts and creating the critical edition, it is based on tradition, on medieval Islamic teachings. Now, let me just be fair to the Quran here too. I'm not here to just beat up on something. That's not always bad. That's not always a terrible thing where there's like, well, we just don't know what the original reading is. We'll never be able to recover the original reading. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you're going for the weight of how do we produce a text that is as close to the original as possible, we have to do critical edition work. The Quran is not based on that. If you only leave it to tradition, you're left with major gaps, issues, insertions, corruptions, and control of the text. And that's what we're going to find is happening here. The corruptions lead to control, and whoever controls the text controls its narrative. And if you have critical editions that leave their mark in history at different points, and you have a basis to go off of, You can't deviate so far from it that you leave it for one person or even one group to control. And what we're going to find in the New Testament is it was impossible with the widespread distribution of the New Testament to control a narrative or to control a text. And we're going to look at that comparison as we delve into this. Now, the Hadith, and let me just define some terms to those who are listening. This is maybe your first time listening in listening to teaching or understanding or anything as it relates to the text of the Quran. The Hadith is simply an oral tradition that explains the Quran. It gives commentary to the Quran. Now, that's not, again, it's not a bad thing. We have a lot of commentary or homilies in the New Testament. I mean, we enjoy going to the different homilies where we're talking about origin. And specifically, he did quite a bit of allegory as it relates to the New Testament homilies. We love John Chrysostom's homilies. We enjoy the teachings and the instruction and the traditions. But the Hadith is an oral tradition that was later collected. Oral tradition is not bad, but oral tradition can change. And oral tradition is harder to trace, especially if somebody decides to record that oral tradition down the road. Now, it makes claim about what the Quran is and what it teaches, which you would expect in any kind of tradition. This is the Quran. This is what it says. This is what it means. That's not bad. Now, what's in the Quran that are not in what's today's text called the Quran text, that is something that we don't have to deal with in the New Testament. So the Hadith makes claims about what was in the Quran that are actually not around in the current circulating text of the Quran. There's teachings that we're sitting there reading from the Hadith and saying, wait, where's that teaching coming from? Where is that tradition? It's not in the Quran text. So what are they referring to when they say the Quran teaches? Because you don't see them. That becomes problematic. Now, there are a few issues with this in the church fathers quoting the New Testament. Very, very, very few. Most of which can be examined and explained, not because it was something that was received from the New Testament, but rather probably oral tradition from the apostles. A perfect example, just in passing, a perfect example is Papias of Hierapolis. He wrote 5 volumes from what he learned from the living and abiding voices. We've talked about that. It's actually one of the first episodes we ever did. If you missed that, just go back to the very, very beginning when we started doing this on the podcast. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you will not find that on the YouTube channel, but you will find it in the podcast platforms. Papias made a lot of claims that we just don't have in the New Testament. And he's saying that they came from the apostles' teachings. But again, it's different if you know the apostles and you've listened to some of their teachings and then you've instructed others from what you learned from them. And then that's why Papias wrote 5 volumes of what he learned that's not a part of the New Testament teachings. So we shouldn't be surprised to see extra from somebody like a Papias of Hierapolis. This is different. Papias wasn't just doing some sort of interpretation of the New Testament in certain places. He was actually teaching all new teachings, all new instruction that's beyond what the New Testament taught. That did come from oral tradition. However, the Hadith is giving claims about what was in the Quran that is not represented in the current text, the Quran text of the Quran. That's a huge difference. And I've debated a couple of Muslims on this, and they try to make this argument as if they're equally compared. And it's like, wait a minute. We're talking about oral tradition that's beyond the New Testament that's being stated that this was taught by Jesus, or this was taught by Peter, or this was taught by one of the apostles, versus they're teaching this is what 1 Peter, Matthew, John teach. And then you go to your gospel and you're like, I don't see that in John. I don't see that in Matthew. I don't see that in anything that Peter said. Those are major differences. So the Hadith is not comparable to, say, somebody like Papias of Hierapolis. I do not believe we can use that as a comparison. Now let's talk about issues in continuation with the origin. Abdullah Masood, was said to be, quote, most like Muhammad. Now, he becomes a very important person as we discuss this further, because when we talk about Abdullah Masood, he begins a good and really fair relationship with Muhammad and his teachings and becomes the most familiarized with what Muhammad taught. Now, he met Muhammad while shepherding, and it was here that Muhammad began to teach from the Quran. Later, Abdullah said that Muhammad taught him 70 surahs. Now, the surahs are sections, 70 sections of teachings from the Quran. Now, this is still preserved. This teaching is still preserved today. We have this in different books, relations, and traditions. So here he is. Abdullah, he meets Muhammad, he's shepherding, he becomes a follower of Muhammad. He is a faithful student of Muhammad. He begins to learn, and he instructed him. He was instructed by Muhammad in 70 specific teachings that he had memorized, was able to recite back. Now, Muhammad at this point recognized Abdullah as one of the foremost experts of the Quran. This is from Muhammad's perspective. He realized out of the top students, the top teachers of these surahs, these teachings, these sections, he came to conclude Abdullah is one of 4 of the best in the teachings. Now, Muhammad is reported as asking Abdullah on an occasion to recite the Quran. Abdullah asked him, should I, quote, should I recite it to you when you were the one to whom it was sent down and revealed? It's a fair question. Muhammad is coming to Abdullah and saying, listen, I want you to recite the Quran to me. He's like, why? You receive these divine teachings. Why should I teach them and recite them back to you? Muhammad replied with these words, I love to hear it from someone else. I love to hear it from someone else. Abdullah is recorded as quoting the Quran until Muhammad was brought to tears. So Muhammad says, Abdullah, I want you to quote the Quran. He's like, why? I'm not worthy to do that. You're the one that received these divine oracles. Why should I do this? And then he tells him, listen, I want to hear it from somebody else. And he is known for having it memorized and was known as one of Muhammad's best scholars by Muhammad's own recognition. So that's Abdullah. Let's bring a second character into play here, Uthman. Uthman was the son-in-law to Muhammad. Now, Uthman produced a standardized version of the Quran in the year 652. Now, he sent a copy to each of the provinces that were Islamic and ordered that all Quranic texts, quote, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole entire copies, must be burned. That's in the Bukhari, okay? This was the beginning of what became the top copy tradition. So here's Uthman. He produced a text that is called the Quran. And in the production of that text, he orders any other version or rendition of the Quran to be burned, whether it's entire copy or a fragment. Now, why is this significant? Well, what we begin to see is rivalry within the same tradition and text. We have nothing like this comparable in the New Testament. We don't see Byzantine Greek churches telling the people in the West, start burning your Latin editions, start burning your Ethiopic editions, start burning your Syriac traditions. We don't see anything even remotely close to this in the New Testament, nor can it be compared to this. This is simply a way to control the text. Now, understand this. In the province of a lot of these Islamic areas, the spreading of these teachings of Muhammad through the Quran's teachings and surahs have been limited, whereas the New Testament was widely spread into the continents and going into Europe, or whether you're looking over, even we find later that the New Testament, even like Gospels like Matthew, were already in India by the end of the 2nd century. The distribution down into Africa, the distribution in Syria, the distribution in Europe, the distribution in regions outside, even into the North African provinces. The New Testament was widespread in the East and the West, in the North and the South, very, very quickly. It would have been impossible for a single scribe or a single scholar or a single bishop to control the narrative of the text without being caught. May I give us a simple example, folks? Marcion in the 2nd century tried to manipulate and exterminate elements of the teachings of Paul and mutilate the Gospel of Luke. The entirety of the world churches rose to the occasion to respond to Marcion. This is where we get documents like the anti-Marcionite prologue. This is where Irenaeus comes in. This is where Tertullian comes in. We now have a response from the East. We have a response from the West. We have a response from the South. We have major rise and really challenged the teaching of the day that was seeking to corrupt and control a text and impersonate writers. Happened all the time. Here, the son-in-law of Muhammad orders the burning and destruction of any other edition of the teachings of the Quran. Now, Masud accused Uthman's scribes of adding 3 extra surahs, Surah 1, Surah 113, and Surah 114, that had never been part of the original teachings of Muhammad. And also there was additional accusations that other small renditions and additions and omissions took place within Uthman's text. Now, we don't have this problem, again, in the early New Testament. When we look at Polycarp or Irenaeus or Justin Martyr, the apostles did not have a level of disagreement or rivalry. They were not turned against each other. There was not a rivalry challenge of, oh, my text is better than this text. There was examinations of the text and additions that were put out, as we discussed earlier in the program. So let's talk about some early variants of the Quran. Say Surah 3, 158. The Topkapi manuscript, which is the Uthman textual tradition, says, if you should die or be slain, you shall not be gathered. The 1924 canon text, Qur'an text, says, if you should die or be slain before him, you shall undoubtedly be gathered. Quite different. Let's think about this too. So Abdullah Umar, which is a companion of Muhammad and a prominent authority of the Hadith, he says this as we look at some of the changes in the disruption. This is their own scholars. He's a companion of Muhammad, okay? He's a companion of Muhammad. He says, let none of you say, I have got the whole of the Quran. How does he know what all of it is? Much of the Quran is gone. Let him say instead, I have got what has survived. You see, you don't see that kind of language. Let me give you an example. Polycarp. So here's Abdullah Umar, who is a companion of Muhammad. Let's take a companion of one of the apostles, Polycarp of Smyrna. Writing a letter to the Philippian church, he says this as it relates to the teachings, not that they're gone. He says, for neither am I, nor in any other like unto me, am able to follow the wisdom of the blessed and glorious Paul, whom when he came among you, taught face to face with men of that day, the word concerning the truth carefully and surely, who also, when he was absent, wrote a letter unto you, in which if you look diligently, you shall be able to be built up in the faith given to you. Now, this is around the year 130 to 150 when Polycarp wrote this. So let's just say this is about 70 plus years after the apostle Paul's death. Okay? 70 plus years after Paul was martyred. He doesn't say things like, let's stop talking about Paul's letter as if it still exists. Much of it's gone. Rather, we have what survived. That's not what Polycarp said. He says, hey, Paul wrote you a letter. You need to go look at that letter diligently. And if you look at that letter, your faith is able to be built up. Two things. Number one, Polycarp assumes they still have that letter. Think about this, folks. Papyri lasts about 100 to 120 years if it's taken care of very carefully and it is preserved. It is possible, but I didn't say they did. It is possible by the survival of a papyri that they still had the original because it would have been 70 years later. It's still within that 100 to 120 years of papyrus. 70 years later, it is possible that what Polycarp was referring to as still being in Philippi was the original text. Okay, let's say it wasn't. They copied it so much it wore out. It is possible they had a second addition to that text because it was a written tradition, not an oral tradition. Now, he mentions an oral tradition earlier in the quote. He said, he taught you face to face with men of that day, word which concerned the truth carefully and surely. So there was an oral tradition still in the church, he reminds him of, but the written tradition still survived just as accurately, if not the original itself. And there's many, many more examples that we could demonstrate of this being true. So here's the question. Here's how we keep this in our scope, in our mind. When we talk about texts like the Qur'an, or we talk about texts like the New Testament, and we're looking for superiority in tradition and preservation and keeping and distributing to churches and controlling narratives, the Quran had major flaws. Companions of Muhammad disagree with what's in the text today. We have readings that don't exist in the early teachings, in oral traditions. We have disagreement amongst Muhammad's students. We have disagreement with Muhammad's son-in-law and others. By the way, people were put to death within Islam amongst themselves over which text people were using. There were major, major uprisings that led to burning and destroying certain editions to control a singular stream. That did not happen in the New Testament. There's no way to demonstrate that in the New Testament. That leaves the transmission far more pure. That leaves the ability to control out of the hands of a single group, single church, single bishop, single area. The New Testament was so widespread. The Great Commission was the greatest preserver of the New Testament. Go into all the world, preach the gospel. That is it. Begin Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth. That is the greatest preserver of the New Testament text. The Gospels, the epistles being distributed at multiple places around the world prevented a singular manipulative opportunity for people to control its narrative. We do have differences. We do have issues. We do have manuscript traditions that added later or left out lines. We're not denying that. But we also have a lot of evidence with the compilation and critical editions to examine the evidence of each and to distribute that properly based on the weight of evidence. And we have multiple extant manuscripts, well over 5,000, in order to examine the fullness of how the New Testament. And then we have over 1 million quotes from the early church fathers combined all the way from the Reformation back to the time of Papias and the others who were disciples, the apostles. And we can examine and reconstruct an entire New Testament, save just a handful of verses, just from quotes. Just from quotes. So with that being said, with that being understood, we have a superior text than the Quran. We have a superior text that is not controlled, that was not manipulated or contradicting itself. By that, this short episode, we hold to the superiority of the teaching of the New Testament and the transmission of the New Testament. All right, folks, that's all we've got time for today. Thanks for tuning to this episode. If this is your first time listening on the podcast, make sure you hit that notification and start following these episodes as they come out. If you are on YouTube listening for the first time, hit that like and subscribe button, and that way you get new content as it is revealed. There's also in the description those that want to continue to support. You can give just simple $5, $10 monthly donations. It allows you to be a part of our bi-monthly newsletter. That is available in the link in the description, both on the podcast and on YouTube. So make sure you're clicking these things, checking out new content that we're putting out. We're still building and working on new episodes ahead. Looking forward to sharing those with you. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. Grace and peace to you. God bless.